Well, welcome everybody. This class is great. We're graciously thankful that Michaels is hosting us, and we are going to be talking about doing a do-it-yourself gift and packaging it using a lot of different tools. I'm Dan Cunningham, and I am first and foremost an engineer at Fiskars. I've been here for about 13 years. But I'm also a crafter. So I've had my hands in a lot of the tools designs of the tools you'll see here. But because I'm intimately familiar with how to do these crafts, I've made sure that they are going to work really well for it. So along the way, we're going to have 3 stages of this. We're going to be taking a pre-existing design that you've used from an electronic die cutter you've created. We're going to be applying it to, in this case, a little glass tumbler. And then we're going to be packaging it both with a box and with a label or tag that can double up as an ornament. So all 3 of those stages are kind of be shown and described, and let's hope it all works the way I hope it will. But along the way, if there are questions, feel free and put them in the chat. I have a few colleagues of mine at Fiskars in the chat as well that they may be able to help answer. If not, at the end, I bet we will have some time to field some of those questions to me, and I should be able to answer them. So without further ado, this is the do-it-yourself gifting project within Fiskars. So to start, let me show you some of the examples of the things that we're going to do. And I briefly overviewed them. We're going to be using a die cut pattern of something that we already die cut in a die cut machine. We're going to process this using Fiskars tools to the point where it's something that we can place onto a tumbler, something like shown in the middle, and then I'll kind of give you that little hint of what we're going to do to package it at the end. So to start, I'll show off an overhead view that I'll be switching between this overhead view and a view kind of the products themselves. But I mentioned we have a design that we've already cut out on a die cutting machine. In this case, this one says cheers, and we're going to be applying that to this glass tumbler. So most of you have probably already done some die cutting. I'm not going to get into the detail of how to use those. So I'm starting at the point where we've got it out of the machine. It's already cut down small to size, and I'll start showing you some of the tools that we'll use to process those things. So specifically, we have a set of tools for vinyl processing, and those are a 3-in-1 vinyl tool. So this 3-in-1 vinyl tool, I'll show you the features of this that'll help the vinyl processing. And we also have another 2-in-1 vinyl applicator and scraper. So going back to that overhead view, I'm going to show you this 3-in-1 tool has got a couple things going for it, specifically 3. One is you can pop the top right off, and this is a cutter, kind of like a gift wrap cutter or something that you can take to cut out the vinyl itself, or even transfer tape. So I'm actually going to do that now because we're going to need some transfer tape later, but I know the size of the transfer tape that we're going to need is about this big, and this is handy enough that you just slide right through and it makes the cut. It's got a very small but sharp razor blade in there that slices right along. And yet it's still safe, so it's not something that you can cut yourself on. So very handy tool to have for cutting both the vinyl itself and the transfer tape. The second feature that I really love about this is it's got a nice weeding tool. It's built right in. So this weeding tool, if you're unfamiliar with vinyl cutting, you've cut out a whole bunch of shapes, and now you've got little bits of vinyl left in between letters that you need to remove. Now, with a weeding tool, it can be somewhat, easier than doing it by hand, but most of the time you've got some sort of tool that you grab and you peel a corner up and it comes out. But a lot of times people are putting all of these little weeded pieces out onto a mat or onto something. So the third feature, which is really handy with this tool, is a scraper. So that scraper just lets you scrape the weeding tool through this a little bit softer plastic, and it deposits the extra weeded out bits inside the container. So as I'm coming along, I can weed off each of the little middle parts and then just deposit them right into this trash. Now later, when you're done, you can actually open this up really easily. It can access all of these right in here. but it still closes it off. So it's a container for you until you're ready to rid yourself of all of those extra little bits of weed. So I've kind of demonstrated this a couple times, and this class is not intended to be watching me weed as much as that might be therapeutic. So I'm going to hop over to one that I've already done. So I've completely peeled the excess vinyl off. All that's remaining is this nice shiny gold vinyl. The sticky is down because this is how we're going to adhere it to the glass, but I've taken all the excess vinyl out. So the second step for this is to take some transfer tape. So this transfer tape was cut off a larger roll, and just like cutting vinyl, you can cut it with this slicey bit, but this you also, sometimes the corners can be tough. You can use the weeding tool to peel up a corner pretty nicely, and then you can peel the transfer tape right off. So that transfer tape is going to get applied right to that leftover vinyl. I'm going to line it up nice just because it's something that'll help us later. But now you can kind of give it a good push, but really that's where this scraping tool can come in. The scraping tool is all about getting the transfer tape really well adhered to that vinyl that's remaining on there. Because the idea is you're going to be pulling this transfer tape off the backer, and you want all of the vinyl to come with it. You don't want it to stay on the backer. So by using either the rigid side or the slightly more flexible side, you can really push that down, give it really good adhesion right to that transfer tape. So let's see how well this works. Now, by starting at a corner and slowly peeling, let's see if I can, there you go. You can see it starts to come up. So that it's coming right off the backer paper. That's good. We want to make sure none of it stays on the backer. Yeah, there you go. It all came off. Oh, a little bit of the weeding bit stuck on there. I'll get that off there. So now we have a beautiful piece of transfer tape with our design nicely aligned right in the middle. And vinyl is already sticky on this side, so it's ready to be applied to this glass tumbler. Now, normally you'd say, okay, you just line it up and you put it in place, but that's where our next set of tools come in. So let me flip back to show off our next set of tools. The next set of tools for vinyl processing are for aligning those pieces of transfer tape or the vinyl itself to the object that you're going to put it on. And there's two different versions of this, and I'm going to show both of them off, but they are for aligning and applying the vinyl either to something that's flat, as you see on the left, or something that's cylindrical, like a tumbler or a water bottle or things like that, that are rounded and have an opening at the top. So let me flip back and I can start showing that off. So this tool is the cylindrical one. It looks kind of long and it maybe looks a little bit confusing, but there's a few key features that you need to see. There are some feet. The feet are gray in this case. The feet are going to be placed either around on the outside of the glass, and you can slide it and pinch it closed, and so it actually grabs around the outside of the glass. Or in some cases, you want to put it on the inside of the glass, and it's the same process there. You slide it on the inside and then you stretch it open. But either way, what you're doing with this is you're creating a rigid attachment between the alignment tool and the glass itself. So it makes sure that it doesn't fall off or move after you've gotten your alignment just right. Now this front end of the tool is for holding that vinyl, the transfer tape with the vinyl on it. It's got two movable arms, so it can accommodate different sizes of a vinyl sheet, and then it's got a middle piece. And what you're going to do is you're going to take and you're going to slide the transfer tape under the middle and over the side ones until you get it to about the right spot. It's really up to you. This part is not as critical, getting it right in place. But once it's in place like this, then that's where this front piece can do some cool things. It can slide forward and it can rotate down. So what you can do would be to do a rough kind of general alignment of this, it came off, of that transfer tape before you stick it to anything. So you can make sure it's lined up correctly. So I can kind of give this a little bit of turn or twist to make sure it gets nice and centered, as well as parallel to the cup's top. So that's what you really want. But it's still not stuck. You can see it's slightly separated from the edge of that cup. So now that I've got it in a place that I like it, I can press on the center. By pressing down on the center, you push the vinyl right to the middle, and now it's touching the glass, and I can move the arms. And if I move these arms out of the way, now that vinyl is stuck in the middle on the glass, and I can remove this piece. And the vinyl didn't ever move off of that alignment. Next, we go back to that peeling tool. That tool can be used to press that vinyl down right up against that glass. Often nice to start from one side, work your way around, or start from the middle where you've already pressed it down, and then work your way around. Kind of using that softer one because that's going to let you kind of follow the texture of the thing you're wrapping it over, and just nice and press firmly down. So once that's all firmly pressed down, that's when you can remove this temporary transfer tape, and the beautiful decoration is left behind, and you have a wonderful gift that's already, if it was a custom, it may have said the name of the person that you're going to gift it to, or, it's a wedding gift and it might say Mr. and Mrs. Or in this case, this might just be a festive cheers. This is for you to give for Christmas. So this is a wonderful gift that already is great. But not only that, we're going to take it a notch higher. We're going to customize and DIY the packaging and the tag, which will double as a Christmas ornament in this case, to maybe put as decoration. So that's where we're going to move on to a very similar process with vinyl, but we're going to do it onto a different surface. In this case, we're going to start with the tag / ornament. And this clear acrylic little circle is going to have that decoration right on top. You see it says Happy Holidays, and then we'll even add something to make it look a little nicer as well. But the process of this is really simple as well. You're going to start with this circular acrylic piece. I'm going to use some chalk paint, and I already did that so that it wasn't wet while I was doing it, but just a little bit, apply some chalk paint to the back side. So when you flip it over, you've got a nice white surface to work on. I made a couple just to show you can maybe do it. Oh, it's hard to tell. That one's a little lighter, one's a little darker, but in the video they look pretty much the same. But it's really up to you kind of how much chalk paint you want to put on there. Make it slightly more white. Almost looks like snow, which is kind of nice. I thought that was a good addition to that. But after you've got your chalk paint applied and it's dried, you're going to do a similar process to what we did on the glass, but you're going to use the transfer tape to put a Happy Holidays onto this surface, and it's going to be flat. So because it's flat, we can't use a cylindrical one. So I'll show off the next tool. So once again, I'm not here for you to watch me weed. So I had another one cut that if something goes wrong, I can do, but I also have one that's pre-weeded. So it already says Happy Holidays. So I'm going to go back to that transfer tape. And you know what? I'm going to reuse that same transfer tape that I had before. We're going to see if that works. I'm hoping it will. So once again, you're going to take your it's almost a squeegee, but it's definitely a presser to press down that transfer tape right onto the vinyl that's already been weeded so that we can peel it off that backer paper. So once that's nice and tight on there, just as you saw it before, I'm going to peel the transfer tape up. And I'm trying to decide which side to start with. I don't want to start with the side that'll immediately catch on a corner. So I want to, all right, there we go. So you kind of give it, you try and keep the tape flat while moving the backer paper away. That way the vinyl will stay in place on that backer paper and it'll peel right off the backer paper quite nicely. So we're at the stage we were last time where we've got the vinyl on the transfer tape, but in this time we're going to use a slightly different version. But even though it looks a little bit different, it's going to have the same set of features. In this case, it's got a base that instead of having the gray feet, this base is large and flat and it's got non-slip feet on the bottom. So once it's in place, it's not going to move. It also has these arms, if you recognize those same types of arms, for you to be able to put that transfer tape inside there. And it also has that same concept of putting it and getting it closely aligned before you apply it to the thing. So in this case, this slides up and down, and it even slides in and out to help you do some alignment. So just like before, I'm going to apply the transfer tape into the arms. In this case, I'm going to place a notebook paper right underneath it to kind of help elevate it. I'm going to take the transfer tape that says Happy Holidays. I'm going to slide it under the middle one and over the other two arms, get it kind of nicely aligned and centered. And then I'm going to take my pre-dried, make sure it's dry, otherwise you'd have some problems, and put it underneath. And then I can just manually lower it down until it's close on top. And now I can even use the paper that I've got this set on to get it nicely centered. So I want it to go right to where I want it. Kind of give it a little bit of fine adjustment so it won't go over the edge, and then lower it the rest of the way down right under there. And just like before, you press on the center until you get contact, and then you can move the arms out of the way and raise the whole thing up or slide it out. And I've transferred that Happy Holidays. It's not fully stuck down yet. It's still only placed in that middle where I was touching it. So that's when you can work your way from the center to the outside to push all that vinyl nice and strongly against the little acrylic ornament. That's nicely centered. So once you've got that, the peel happens again. That peel leaves the vinyl while removing the transfer tape. And we've got a nice stuck Happy Holidays with a nice white background, perfectly centered where I wanted it, using that alignment tool. So this simple little tool doesn't have that many moving parts. It's just got a couple that slide it up and down and slide it in and out, and then the arms that allow it to move aside. It gives you the ability to pre-place that, get it all aligned before you commit to sticking it down onto the thing you're trying to do. So after this was the hard part. Now you take a bit of ribbon, fold it around, and maybe hot glue it right on the top. And you've got that ornament and the tag potentially ready for you. I'm going to skip right to here. I didn't need to show you how to hot glue ribbon, so I'm just going to move to this point. Now we still need a way to package up the glass tumbler in a safe way that is personal, that really shows that you care, and it's not just a store-bought box. So this is where the final tool comes in that we're going to talk about for customization of a gifting tool. And this is, click the wrong button. This is our gifting board. Now here I'm showing some examples of things you can do, and some of them look pretty complicated. And how can we use a tool to make a custom box? Well, the gifting board, it looks a little bit complicated, but I'm going to show you it step by step and show you that it really isn't as difficult as it might look. You know, it's not a very large board. You know, it's about this big. It's a little bit thick, but not too thick because there's some mechanism stuff going on inside. But it's going to allow you to make a custom box of the size of your choosing. I'll show you how that works. So to start, let's zoom in a little bit. There are orange pieces on here that you'll be able to use to customize the size of the box. And to start looking at number 1 is the first orange slider. That's going to set the base length of the box. So these make rectangular boxes that have a square bottom, but then can be of different heights. So in our case, we have something that is this glass. Oh, it's the wrong glass. The Cheers glass is exactly 3-inch circle. And I can measure that using either a tape measure or my cutting mat that I'm working on has a scale right on it. So I can lay it down and say, okay, yeah, that's 3 inches. So it's 3 inches by 3 inches. So the first thing that we will do will be to take that gifting board and slide that until it gets down to the 3-inch mark. There's a little indicator right here, that orange dot. As you slide it up and down, it's going to line up to the side with a number that says 3. Now the range of sizes that this can make is between 2 and 4 inches. So the largest thing it can make is a 4 by 4 box on the bottom, and that's the largest size at the bottom. And the smallest it can make is a 2 by 2. The second step, number 2 on there, is up in this corner, and this is a different slider. And this slider, as it moves back and forth, does some more internal stuff you don't need to worry about, but you're going to line the dot up to the measurement above it. and you can see in the picture it's a little easier, that also has a range of 2 inches to 4 inches. So the largest box that you can make, and I'll show you exactly why that's the largest, is a 4-inch by 4-inch by 4-inch box. But the smallest is a 2-inch by 2-inch by 2-inch, and you can vary the box size to whatever you want. In our case, we want a 3-inch base, but our Cheers glass is taller than 3 inches tall, so we cannot make a cube-shaped box. It needs to be, now if I lay it down here and look, it needs to be just short of 4 inches. So let me flip back to this overhead view and show you what we do. So we have on this side, this shows the indication here. This is the box bottom width. We said we wanted that 3 inches. So I slide my little arrow right to that 3 inches. And then we want a box height of something just short of 4 inches. You know what? I might leave it right at 4 inches. So we got a 3-inch by 4-inch. Maybe that gives a little space for, a little tissue paper for us to put into that glass. So we've got 3-inch by 4-inch. And the final thing you look at is this thing in the middle here, and it says box paper size guide. That box paper size guide is telling you how big of a sheet of paper you have to start with. So in our case, this has slid up to about 10.5 inches plus maybe about a 1/16 of an inch. So we'll say 10.5 plus a 1/16. It can be flexible. Like if it were 10.5 exactly, it'd probably work just fine. So actually I'm gonna adjust this down just a hair and we're gonna make it exactly a 10.5 inch sheet of paper. Now the best paper to use for these types of boxes is a slightly heavier weight craft paper. And these typically come in 12 by 12 size. And that's exactly why the largest box we can make is a 4-inch by 4-inch by 4-inch box, because that uses a 12-inch sheet of paper. Because it's hard to come by craft paper bigger than 12 inches, we didn't think it was important to have boxes bigger than what used a 12-inch paper. So we didn't. This is where we started. The craft paper is what most people have. So in this case, we need a square that is, as indicated, 10.5 by 10.5. So here I bumped it. There you go. I take out my handy paper trimmer, fold open the arm so I can see where that 10.5 by 10.5 is. Let's see, what color should we use? Let's do a nice decorative. It's almost festive here. It's a bunch of circles all over it. And we line this right up to that 10.5 mark on the ruler. There you go. Fold that down. Easy as that. We've got it in 10.5 in this dimension. Now I rotate it and line up the next 10.5. And as simple as that, we have a piece of craft paper that is now 10.5 by 10.5, just the right size to make a box that is 3 inches by 3 inches on the bottom and 4 inches tall, just short of 4 inches. Next is the fun of this tool. I'll show you how to actually do it. This also has a flip out arm. You can rotate it for bigger pieces of paper, but the key to this tool is this little scribe, or the scoring tool. So this scoring tool's got a round bump at the end, and it's going to make all the creases that you'll need to get that box exactly 3 by 3 by 4. Feels a little strange, but you're actually going to flip the decorative side down, and you're going to line it up diagonally across this flat shoulder right here. And you're going to slide it all the way down until it touches that orange indicator that we set. And this is so that it's going to place all the crease lines that we're about to draw in the right place. So once I've got it against the fence and down here against this orange indicator here, I'm going to take my scoring tool, reach right up in here, and then follow, I know it's hard to see because it's invisible, a crease that is built right into the box itself. So there's a crease right here and a crease right here. So the score lines. So I'm going to line it back up. So there we go. So got one crease here, one crease going down. I bumped it just a hair. And then there's that third one from this orange place down to a diagonal like this. Final thing you do right here is a punch. and it punches. And now you've created a nice little folding notch here. After you've done it once, you rotate it quarter turn, you line it back up to the same places, and you're just going to repeat this same process 4 times. I'm not pressing very hard on this scoring. It's just enough to create a little bit of a crease and punch. And do this 2 more times. Nice, easy score lines, doing 3 on each side here, and a punch, and 1 more time. Crease, score line, 3, and a punch. Now, we do have a few more things to punch because we punched out these corners, but you see they're not centered. We're going to need some more. So you flip it over. You don't need to do any more creasing, but you line it right up to these same spots that you had it before and do 4 more punches. Now, it's handy because you can always line up to the same thing on every single one, and it'll always be right in the right spot. Now, there's some other fun things that this tool does, which we'll get to in a second, but to start, let's fold this. So we've got the decorative side down, and each one of these fold lines are just going to gently go up. These diagonal ones go up in line like that. We've got some outer top flaps. You see how these are going to become the tops. And then there are some midline folds that we fold inward. And you'll see what those are doing in a second. You can almost see the box starting to take shape at this point. And it feels about the right size for the tumbler, but last try. So we've got all these sized ready. And when you close this up, you're going to get a nice box formed with the top flaps. But how do you keep them together? Well, that's where this tool can come in handy as well. Each corner has either a rounded corner punch, if you slide it in here, or it's got what's called a locking punch. If I punch the locking punch, it creates a little notch in here. I'm going to do that across the way, locking punch. You know what? I'm going to do 4 locking punches. I don't know if... We'll see if this works. I've never done 4. At least it'll look nice. It does leave a little pile of our punched out pieces that you'll have to clean up. But here's that moment of truth. I'm going to take our cheers glass in this box that we made the right size. Let's see if it fits. I'm going to fold these up in a nice flower shape, and it closes up. And it looks like it's the right size. Ooh. I don't know if my my locking punches worked as well as I wanted them to. Look at that. There we go. Ooh, got a little extra bit of fold there. I'll just lock the top and not the bottom ones. So now we've got, oh, there we go. It's not my best box in the world, but you know, it is the right size. You can see it's the paper that we liked, the pattern that we wanted. It's nice and fits just right, and it's custom made just for this thing. And if we had, oh, and when it opens, it flowers open. One of the things I like, it looks like it blooms open when you open it up. So in this case, we've got to add a little bit of tissue paper to make sure that it doesn't get smushed. I'm going to close it back up into this design. I like to make it flower open, so I'm going to make sure the arms go in the right ways. And then this closes up. And the locking punch means that you get a nice paper that closes, a box that closes and is nice. And is a nice decorative thing. Now, if you felt like, oh, I need a little more padding around the outside edges, it is very possible to just add a ½ inch of each of these. And you know what? I'm going to go ahead and do that because now that you've seen it once, I'm going to demonstrate it one more time so that we can just make sure it all works and it looks like I've got enough time. So instead of 3 inches by 4 inches, this time I'm going to make it 3.5 by 4 inches. And now that you see how this all works and that we're going to be looking at this, you can see it move. And it moves as you move each one. So it's cool. It's like it's a calculator, a physical calculator telling you exactly how much to beat. So 4 inches by 3.5. This is telling me I need an 11 1/4 size piece of paper. So once again, get out this sheet of new sheet, open this up, and you get out to 11 1/4. There you go. Using most of the paper this time. 11 1/4. Handy to have so many Fiskars tools around. We've got our 11 1/4. So now I'm going to repeat that process that I did last time with the 3.5 by 3.5. Run that right against the fence. Use my happy scoring tool. 2, 3. Can't forget the punch. Line it back up. One, 2, 3. Punch. You can do all 4 of these without moving and without doing any flipping of your paper because, oop, fell off the score line. Because it all has to be done on the same side at first. A little bit of calming repetition to these things. Doesn't take a lot of complex motion. Now I've done the 4 side and all of these, so I flip it over and I do the last 4 punches. And that is all it takes. So once again, we do our folds along these diagonals to give the main folds. Do the top flaps, and then we're going to fold in the parts that then join up. Now a hidden feature that I didn't point out with the vinyl tool is it's also got nice sharp edges along here to make very clean, crisp folds. So if you want to clean up these folds to get them nice and crisp, and then it'll look a little bit nicer at the end. I'll do that. It's kind of like a bone folder, if you've ever used one of those. It's for, paper folding. And in this case, it comes right with this fancy vinyl tool. So now that we've made this 3.5 by 3.5, you can tell it's a little bit bigger. It looks just about that 1/2 inch bigger. So now I can open this up. And if I was going to be traveling with this maybe and I was going to pack it in a bag, I can use an extra piece to close this right up in here. Oh, I hope my 1/2 inch was enough. Yeah, looks like it will be. Ooh, barely there. Oh no! I forgot to do my locking tabs. I'm going to do 2 opposite locking tabs, and then I'm going to do 2 corner punches. The interior ones don't need to lock, only the top ones do. So now they get nice round edges without that locking tab. And here's where I can lay that in the box, close it up. And because I like, again, to have it bloom open, I like to run each of the interior folds around clockwise. Top closes. Oh yeah, I like this one better. That little extra bit of 1/2 inch. I feel better about that. It feels like I can add the padding on the outside. Now it's not going to break along the way. So just a dab of hot glue to add your happy holidays little thing right on top, or even you can get fancy with some twine that, you know, if your acrylic piece had a thread through it, that twine then can double up as an ornament hanger. And you've got this wonderful custom thing that we've made, the tumbler with the vinyl that we've applied to the glass. We've made a custom box fit just right. And with a tool like this, if we want to modify that fit just a little bit, you saw it was easy to do. And then we made vinyl transfers aligned perfectly to the top of the circle and along to the glass as well with our alignment tools. And we've made this beautiful gift that everyone can enjoy, and you know, you have a feeling of accomplishment that, hey, I DIY'd this, I did this myself. So I've showed you a bunch of these tools and kind of showed you the good things about each of them. So this is where I have the opportunity to answer any questions that have come up along the way, and anything I can't answer, I might be able to ask some of my colleagues also in the chat. Anybody want to, I can't see the chat. Anybody want to see if there's questions for me? There might not be. Oh, there's a good number of chat. There's the chat. Oh, and it looks like, oh, Tiffany was already answering questions for me. Perfect. Yeah. Well, it looks like there's no outstanding questions for me. My colleagues were very wonderfully helpful along the way, so thank you very much. Ooh, new message. Well, thank you. Thank you, Lindsay. I enjoy making these types of crafts, and I really enjoy making the tools that help you do these crafts in easier ways. So now, you know, each of these tools can be stored. You know, the scoring tool can be stored right inside the box. The 3-in-1 tool has kind of the thing clips right on the top, and then the weeding tool slides right down the sides and makes a great little handy carrying thing. And then this can go right along with it. So I think if there are no other questions for me, I really appreciate your time, and I'm happy that you were able to take time out of your day to watch me make these crafts. And I hope that it shows you some new tools that will help you with your crafts and accomplish the wonderful things that you want to do.
Hey, Dan.
Yeah.
Joan is asking if we can show how to attach the decal to another acrylic piece, maybe. I don't know if we have.
Sure. I should have extra, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, let's see. You don't want to wait for me to weed out this Happy Holidays. So I do have a Mr. and Mrs., which you probably wouldn't put on onto a thing like this, but I can demonstrate it in the same way. So we have, once again, we've weeded our piece of vinyl. In this case, you know what? It'll fit better if I make a very personal. It's just going to say Mrs. That's all it's going to say. So I'm going to take the cutter, the little gift wrap type cutter, and slice off just the Mrs. Here's the Mrs. That'll fit a little nicer on here. You can take the transfer tape. It does not have to be lined up. I saw that was a question in the chat. It doesn't have to be lined up because it's really all about that vinyl lining up to the final thing. So lay it on there. Use the this tool to press it down in place. Make sure that transfer tape is nice and stuck to the gold vinyl there. And now you peel the backer. So it leaves, here's a situation. The little dot of the S, or the period after the S, it stayed on the backer paper. But because I haven't peeled it all the way, I can just kind of give it a little touch up. Give it a press here. And now when I come back, hopefully it'll, yeah, there you go. It transferred right to the transfer tape. Oh, same thing's happening with that R. Try that as well. There we go. There we go. So it's getting transferred all to that transfer tape. Nothing remaining on the backer. That's exactly what we want to see. So once again, this, we're going to use it right onto the ornament. So this one's a flat one. So we're going to use the flat alignment tool, not the cylindrical one. And once again, just to help raise it up just a hair, I'm going to put my pad of paper under here, and I'm going to use this ornament, place it roughly underneath because I'm going to line up my misses right to, and kind of press down a little bit on this, and it'll help it. I can kind of line this up. And this is where you get it close. You're going to center it. So I'm going to get this centered, because I'm looking straight down. I can see it's lined up perfectly. I know the camera angle is a little bit off, but because it's just right, I can then push in the center, move the arms out of the way, move the whole thing out of the way, and that misses is right in the center. So once again, we use our scraper, our presser, to press that vinyl down onto there. Now when we peel the backer paper, that vinyl, which already was sticky, is left right on there. Misses. How very nice. See, here you could use a Mr. and make a Mr. ornament and a Mrs. ornament, and then you have a pair. Or you make the Mr. and Mrs. a little bit smaller with the vinyl, and then it'll fit both. Or maybe you do the Mrs. and Mr. below, or whatever you want. But I hope that helped to demonstrate the use of this again. Now there was a question, it looks like Kathy had a question of where we got these circle plastic pieces. I think these types of things are at Michael's. I'm not sure if this one exactly came from Michael's. I do know there are other sources. You can do Google searches for online resellers if you needed to, but there's a large variety of things at Michael's that can be used for customizing gifts as well. Maybe I'll take this home to my wife. It's her birthday tomorrow. Well, thank you very much again for your time, and I hope everyone has a great day.